When I first drove down the cracked asphalt road that led back to the land my grandfather had poured his life into, I expected to feel peace. For years I had pictured the rolling hills, the familiar bend of the creek, and the quiet reflection of the dammed pond Pops had engineered back in the 70s. I thought coming home after years of military deployments would finally give me the stability I'd been craving. Instead, I was met with a jarring, ugly sight that burned into my memory and set the stage for the storm that was about to consume Willowbrook Estates. Bright survey flags dotted the ground like confetti after a parade. Concrete mixers churned noisily where cattle once grazed. Bulldozers chewed into the soil with mechanical indifference, and the land that once fed families and provided water for neighbors had been reduced to a development zone. My boots crunched on the gravel with an anger I hadn't felt in years, a weight in my chest pressing heavier with every step. What I saw wasn't just construction. It was an invasion. The 47 acres my family had cherished for 3 generations weren't just real estate. They were the backdrop of my childhood, the testing ground for my discipline, and the living legacy of Pops, the man who had taught me about stewardship of land and water. In the middle of that property stood the modest earth dam he had constructed, a marvel of simple but effective engineering, designed to collect rainwater and regulate the flow of Willow Creek. To outsiders, it might have looked like a humble pond, but to us it was life itself, the reason cattle thrived during droughts, and the reason neighbors downstream could count on steady flow when rains ran dry. That dam wasn't just dirt and stone. It was Pops's signature on the land, backed by federal engineers who'd ensured it complied with flood control standards. Standing there, I felt a heat that had nothing to do with the Texas sun. Someone had stolen more than dirt. They had stolen legacy, heritage, and blood. The signs were everywhere. The development wasn't some random construction project. This was the infamous Willowbrook Estates HOA, the pride of the suburban elite who craved perfectly manicured lawns and uniform houses lined up like teeth in a grinning mouth. They had bulldozed their way into my family's land, laying foundations for 35 homes downstream of my dam, as if they owned the water, the soil, and the history that came with it. The arrogance was astounding. But the story of how they got there, and how I eventually made them regret every last nail they hammered into my soil, was as tangled as the roots of the oak tree Pops once planted by the creek. While I had been deployed overseas, 2 tours in Afghanistan, working as a Corps of Engineers officer specializing in water management, the property had been in the hands of a management company. My sister, well-meaning but far removed in California, had left the daily details to them, trusting that taxes were paid and upkeep handled. What she didn't realize was that behind the scenes, a storm was brewing. The HOA, led by its Queen Bee president Maggie Thornwell, had maneuvered with ruthless efficiency. Using loopholes, zoning changes pushed through by her councilman husband, and the sneaky application of adverse possession laws, they claimed large swaths of our acreage. In their eyes, the land had been abandoned, sitting idle while they had visions of expanding their pristine neighborhood. Their plan was simple: swallow my family's property, build out their empire of McMansions, and erase our legacy beneath concrete and manicured sod. But their plan had a fatal flaw, one they couldn't comprehend because they had no respect for history or the power of water law. My grandfather had been smarter than most men of his time. Not only had he constructed that dam under federal oversight, giving it protections HOAs couldn't simply override, but he had also secured senior water rights dating back to 1923. Those rights meant that while they might manipulate zoning and paperwork, they couldn't alter the fact that every drop flowing through Willow Creek was mine to control, mine to allocate, and mine to defend. The first days back were a blur of shock, anger, and determination. The HOA strutted like conquerors, Maggie parading in her tennis whites as if this was all perfectly legitimate. She greeted construction crews in her golf cart, waving like royalty, her perfume mixing with the acrid stench of diesel. Neighbors, looked on with smug satisfaction, convinced they were part of progress, blind to the theft beneath their feet. What they didn't realize was that their dream homes were rising on stolen soil, and their backyard sat squarely in the floodplain of a dam older than their HOA charter dot. That realization lit a fire inside me. This wasn't just a battle over land. It was a war of legacy against arrogance, of quiet stewardship against loud entitlement, of water against concrete. And as an engineer who had spent years studying how water shapes landscapes, I knew one truth better than most. When you build downstream of a dam, you had better respect who controls the gates. So I started digging, not with shovels, but with records. Courthouses, archives, Corps of Engineers files. Each document was a weapon, each permit a shield. The 1978 flood management permits Pops had secured were still valid, and they gave federal jurisdiction that no city council vote could erase. The 1923 water rights deed was a crown jewel, buried in dusty records, proving beyond any doubt that my family held senior claim to every gallon of Willow Creek's flow. As the HOA rushed to frame walls and pour driveways, I was building a case, stronger than concrete and older than their entire development. Every evening I stood at the edge of the dam, watching the water level drop from their reckless diversions. Every night I felt the weight of Pop's memory, urging me to fight. This wasn't about revenge for revenge's sake. It was about justice, about honoring the man who had built with care while others only destroyed. The HOA thought they were clever, thought their golf carts and bylaws made them untouchable. But water doesn't care about bylaws. Water flows where it is directed, and those who ignore its power eventually learn the hard way, dot. As I stood on that dam at sunset, the orange light reflecting across the ripples, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. The HOA had picked the wrong man to steal from. They had built 35 homes on my land, but they had built them downstream, beneath a dam controlled by the grandson of the man who'd designed it. And when the time came, I was going to remind them, with the force of water and the weight of history, that you don't steal land from a Morrison and expect to live dry. This was only the beginning. The morning after I first confronted the mess on my land, I stood in line at the county courthouse. The smell of old paper and the hum of fluorescent lights mixed with the weight of decades stacked in filing cabinets and bound in dusty ledgers. These walls had seen more schemes than I could imagine, but I doubted any had been as audacious as what the Willowbrook Estates HOA had pulled. I wasn't just looking for evidence. I was hunting for the kind of leverage that could break an empire. And the deeper I dug, the more I realized that Pops had left me far more than memories. He had left me weapons hidden in plain sight, but while I was busy combing through records, the HOA was busy tightening its grip. At the heart of it all stood Margaret Maggie Thornwell, the kind of woman who could smile while filing a lawsuit. She was 52 years old, but she carried herself like a prom queen who had never lost the crown. Her BMW X7 gleamed brighter than the Texas sun, her tennis skirts were as crisp as her cutting remarks, and her influence was bolstered by her husband Rick, a city councilman who had perfected the art of greasing wheels. Maggie wasn't just an HOA president. She was a suburban monarch ruling her fiefdom from the seat of a golf cart, her perfume trail as recognizable as her reputation for passive-aggressive tyranny. Maggie's rise to power in Willowbrook Estates had been carefully crafted. She had branded herself as the protector of community standards, a phrase that in practice meant crushing individuality and enforcing her narrow vision of beauty. Lawn too tall? Fine. Paint shade slightly off? Citation. Garden that didn't match the rest? Lawsuit. People joked she could measure grass with a ruler, but the laughter always carried a nervous edge because everyone knew Maggie didn't joke. Her power came from fear, from the threat of fines and foreclosures. And with Rick's connections, she could push through zoning changes, maneuver around regulations, and silence dissenters with bureaucratic precision. It was through this machinery of control that Willowbrook Estates had extended its reach beyond its original footprint. The HOA wanted expansion, and when my family's land appeared vulnerable during my deployment, Maggie saw her chance. With Sarah living across the country and Lone Star Land Services asleep at the wheel, Maggie filed an adverse possession claim, citing community improvements and maintenance of abandoned property. Then, with Rick's influence, she rammed through an emergency zoning change that reclassified my land from agricultural to residential development. In less than a year, Pops's pastures had been rebranded as Phase 4 of Willowbrook Estates. 35 McMansions sprouted like weeds on soil that had once nourished cattle. Maggie didn't stop there. She weaponized public opinion. She organized HOA meetings where she painted me, a veteran returning from overseas, as some absentee landowner who had abandoned his duty to the community. She fed local reporters stories about an unstable dam threatening new homes, never mentioning that the dam had federal oversight and had passed safety inspections only a year earlier. On neighborhood apps, she wrote vague warnings about aggressive property disputes, never naming me but ensuring that every whisper pointed my direction. By the time I returned, Maggie had cast me as the villain in a story she had authored, the outsider standing in the way of suburban progress. But what Maggie didn't know was that I wasn't the kind of man who bowed to intimidation. I had faced mortar fire in valleys where water was worth more than gold. I had watched entire villages rise and fall on the flow of a single well. And I had learned one lesson over and over again. Water always finds its path, and so does truth. Her empire might have been built on bylaws and signatures, but mine was built on deeds older than her HOA charter and permits signed in federal ink. I didn't need to shout. I just needed to wait. As the days passed, I began documenting everything. I set up trail cameras along the perimeter of my property to record construction activity. I measured creek flow daily, logging each drop diverted illegally by their crews. I photographed the declining water levels in Pops's dam, time-stamped to the hour. Each piece of evidence was a stone stacked into the wall I was building against. Them. My military discipline carried over seamlessly. This was reconnaissance, plain and simple. And while I gathered proof, I made quiet calls to old contacts, engineers, regulators, and even an EPA officer I had served alongside overseas. Each conversation reminded me that I wasn't fighting alone. There were rules Maggie couldn't twist, laws Rick couldn't rewrite, and forces bigger than their HOA charter. Still, it was hard not to feel the pressure. Each night I watched new walls rise across what had been my grandfather's pasture. Each morning I saw crews pour concrete where I had once hunted deer. The speed of construction was deliberate. They were racing against me, trying to finish, before I could mount a defense. Neighbors celebrated each new roofline, oblivious to the fact that they were living on stolen land, in homes perched downstream of a dam whose gates I controlled. They saw progress. I saw arrogance begging to be humbled. One evening, as the sun bled red across the horizon, I stood atop Pops's dam and stared out over the pond. The water was lower than I had ever seen it. Dragonflies skimmed across its shrinking surface, and the air carried the faint scent of exposed mud. I imagined Pops standing beside me, shaking his head at what had become of his careful work. He had always warned me that water was both a gift and a weapon, a force to be respected. As I traced the outline of the spillway with my eyes, I realized Maggie had made one critical mistake. She had built her kingdom downstream. The thought lingered as I walked back to the house, boots crunching on the gravel. For now, I would keep gathering evidence, keep building my case. But deep down, I knew something Maggie did not. She thought her empire was untouchable. She thought paperwork and political strings made her invincible. But water doesn't care about politics. Water doesn't care about BMWs or golf carts or city council votes. Water moves when it's told to move, and someday soon, when the moment was right, The dam would remind Willowbrook Estates who truly held the power in this valley. The war had only begun. The first lesson my military career taught me was that every battlefield has its maps. In Afghanistan, they were topographical sheets and satellite imagery. Back in Texas, the battlefield was paperwork, permits, deeds, zoning codes, and water rights. They were the terrain lines and choke points of this war with Willowbrook Estates. And if there was one thing Pops had drilled into me long before the Army did, it was that you never step onto a battlefield without knowing every inch of ground beneath your boots. For weeks, I lived at the county courthouse buried in dusty records that smelled of mildew and ink. Each ledger, each microfilm reel, and each photocopied document told a story of land, ownership, and power. I traced the lineage of the property back nearly a century, following signatures of men long dead whose decisions still echoed through the soil I stood on. It was there, tucked away in a file marked water use, that I uncovered the first major weapon in my arsenal: the 1923 water rights deed. My great-grandfather had purchased senior rights to Willow Creek at a time when water law was still the backbone of survival in Texas. That deed wasn't just a piece of paper. It was a sword that could cut through Maggie's schemes, older and more binding than her HOA bylaws or Rick's zoning tricks. But that was just the beginning. Digging deeper, I uncovered the original 1978 permits for the dam Pops had built. What most people didn't realize was that Pops hadn't built that structure in isolation. He had worked hand in hand with the Army Corps of Engineers, ensuring it met federal flood control standards. That meant federal jurisdiction, a phrase that sent shivers down the spine of every local official who thought they were in control. No HOA, no city council, not even a county commissioner could override a federally supervised water structure. Pops had been deliberate, and now his foresight gave me the upper hand. Each discovery sent a surge of adrenaline through me, but I knew knowledge alone wasn't enough. Documentation had to be paired with evidence. Proof that Willowbrook Estates was violating the very laws they pretended to uphold. So I documented. Trail cameras snapped photos of construction crews diverting the creek. I logged flow measurements, with military precision, charting every illegal gallon siphoned away from the dam. I photographed erosion scars and shrinking water levels, time-stamped and cataloged in folders thick enough to intimidate any judge. What Maggie saw as a quiet veteran sulking on his porch was actually reconnaissance. Every day, every hour, I was tightening the noose around her empire. Meanwhile, Maggie doubled down. She paraded in front of local news crews, spinning tales about the dangerous dam threatening her community. She stood on her manicured lawn, crocodile tears glistening as she warned of disaster. The anchors ate it up, their cameras lingering on the worried faces of new homeowners who had no idea their queen bee was building her narrative on lies. On the Nextdoor app, Maggie painted me as an unstable, aggressive landowner, dangerous to families and children. She never mentioned my name, but her followers didn't need her to. In a community that small, insinuation was enough. Overnight, I became the villain in their story. But I knew the truth. Villains don't spend hours knee-deep in legal records, searching for ways to honor their grandfather's legacy. Villains don't measure water flow to protect neighbors downstream. Villains don't fight to preserve what was rightfully theirs. Maggie's empire might have been built on perception, but mine was built on fact. And facts have a way of cutting through lies like water carving stone. As weeks turned into months, I began to assemble my allies. My first call was to Tony Riggs, an old Army buddy now working with the EPA. One conversation with Tony opened doors I hadn't even known existed. He confirmed what I had suspected. The construction crews diverting Willow Creek were in violation of the Clean Water Act. They hadn't filed for federal permits, and every trench they dug, every pump they installed, was another nail in their coffin. Tony coached me on how to file complaints, where to submit evidence, and which inspectors would take the matter seriously. It wasn't just a property dispute anymore. It was an environmental case, one that could bring the full weight of the federal government down on Willowbrook Estates. At the same time, I began speaking quietly with neighbors who remembered Pops. Some of them had benefited from the dam over the years, drawing water for cattle or seeing reduced flooding during storms. Their memories became testimonies, informal but powerful, painting a picture of how essential that little earth structure had been for decades. Maggie's narrative of a dangerous relic crumbled under the weight of lived experience. These weren't just stories. They were the roots of a community that had once thrived on cooperation long before Willowbrook Estates tried to monopolize it. Still, the HOA moved fast. Each day, more houses rose, their skeletal frames reaching skyward like arrogant monuments to entitlement. I watched driveways being poured, fences installed, and sod laid down as if the land had always belonged to them. But each brick they placed, each nail they hammered, only built higher the wall of their eventual downfall. They didn't know it, but they were constructing their homes on borrowed time. The pressure mounted. There were nights I sat at the kitchen table staring at stacks of documents, exhaustion heavy in my bones. Some part of me wondered if it was worth it, if Pops would have wanted me to fight this hard. But then I'd walk outside, smell the cedar in the air, and hear the trickle of water down the spillway. That sound wasn't just water, it was memory, history, and duty all rolled into one. Pops hadn't built that dam to see it stolen. He had built it for us, for the land, and for everyone downstream. That knowledge steeled me. I wasn't just fighting for property. I was fighting for legacy. The moment that sealed my resolve came on a sweltering September afternoon. I watched a crew install drainage pipes that cut directly into Willow Creek's natural flow. I knew instantly what it meant. Illegal diversion, plain and simple. As the diesel engines rumbled and mud splashed, I realized the HOA had crossed from shady tactics into outright criminal behavior. And that was the line they should never have crossed. Standing there, sweat dripping and fists clenched, I understood that the battle was no longer theoretical. It wasn't just paperwork, permits, and press conferences. It was real, tangible, and physical. They were stealing the lifeblood of the land, and in doing so, they had awakened something in me I hadn't felt since the war. A fire that burned too hot to extinguish. From that day forward, my mission was clear. I would fight them on paper, in court, and in the press. But if all else failed, I still held the ultimate card, the dam. 35 homes sat downstream, smug monuments to Maggie's arrogance. They thought they owned the future. But the water in that reservoir whispered a different story, and I was the one who decided when it would be told. By November, the valley carried a different kind of silence. It wasn't peace. It was the silence before a storm, the kind that makes the air taste electric and the ground feel restless beneath your boots. The HOA had been bloodied by the court, loss, humiliated by the federal investigation, and rattled by the floods. But Maggie Thornwell wasn't finished. People like her never know when to stop. She still believed she could outlast me, that if she turned up the pressure just enough, I'd fold. She couldn't have been more wrong. The first crack came from inside her own kingdom. Residents of Willowbrook Estates had grown restless. Their dream homes now carried the stink of scandal, their investments bleeding value with every news headline. Carla's articles spread across social media, and neighbors who once sipped wine together now whispered accusations over fences. HOA meetings turned chaotic, with homeowners demanding answers Maggie couldn't give. Why wasn't the dam disclosed in the sale contracts? Why are insurance claims being denied? Why did you authorize illegal diversions? Every question was a hammer strike, and Maggie's composure began to fracture. I attended one of those meetings not as a participant, but as an observer. The community center was packed, every plastic chair occupied, with people spilling into the aisles. Maggie stood at the front, clutching her clipboard like a shield, Rick hovering behind her like a bodyguard. She tried to maintain her smile, that saccharine grin she used to disarm critics, but the room wasn't buying it. When one homeowner accused her of ruining his retirement savings, Maggie snapped, her mask slipping. "This community would be nothing without me," she barked. Gasps rippled through the crowd. I didn't need to say a word. The residents were tearing her down themselves, but cornered animals don't just retreat, they bite. Days later, I found a fresh stack of citations, taped to my gate, fines for improper land maintenance, hazardous conditions, even unauthorized livestock. The absurdity would have been laughable if not for the fact that each fine carried a threat, escalating penalties, liens, foreclosure. Maggie was trying to drag me into the same trap she had used on so many others. The difference was, I wasn't just another resident in her subdivision. I was the man holding the keys to the dam, and she was playing with fire. I didn't pay the fines. Instead, I mailed each one back, stapled neatly to copies of Pop's water rights, and a note that read, "This land doesn't answer to your board. Try again." It was petty, maybe, but it felt good. Meanwhile, the federal investigation deepened. Inspectors returned with drones mapping water flow and erosion patterns. Engineers analyzed my data logs and confirmed what I had been saying all along. The HOA's diversions had destabilized the watershed. They ordered a halt to all construction until further notice. Bulldozers sat idle. Half-built homes stood exposed. To the elements, and crews were sent home without pay. The entire development project, once Maggie's crown jewel, became a carcass rotting in plain sight. But Maggie wasn't done scheming. One evening, as I sat on the porch with a cup of coffee, a convoy of black SUVs rolled down the county road. They stopped at the edge of Willowbrook and outstepped men in suits, developers, lawyers, city officials. Maggie had called in reinforcements. If she couldn't bully me directly, she'd try to drown me in legal fees, red tape, and political pressure. The message was clear. She wasn't fighting alone anymore. That night, I couldn't sleep. I paced. The dam, the moonlight glinting off the water's surface. The reservoir was full, swollen from recent rains, its surface rippling with restless energy. 35 homes sat downstream, their driveways lined with SUVs and manicured lawns, monuments to arrogance gleaming under porch lights. I stood at the release valve, my hand hovering inches above the steel wheel. A single turn, and gravity would do the rest. The water would roar through the spillway, reclaiming the land in a torrent of mud and fury. It would be justice, swift, undeniable, biblical. But justice and vengeance are twins, separated only by intent. Pop's voice echoed in my head. The land remembers, but it doesn't forgive recklessness. My hand trembled, torn between the temptation of raw power and the discipline he had drilled into me. I stepped back, forcing myself to breathe. The time wasn't right. Not yet. The following week, I received an anonymous letter in the mail. No return address, just a single page with messy handwriting. Watch your back. Maggie's planning. Something. HOA board meeting Tuesday night. At first I thought it was a prank, but curiosity gnawed at me. And Tuesday found me parked a block from the community center, binoculars in hand. Through the windows, I saw Maggie at the podium, animated, furious, her voice carrying even through the glass. Rick paced like a caged animal, gesturing at blueprints spread across the table. From what I could make out, they weren't planning a defense. They were planning an offense. A new lawsuit bigger than before. A motion to have the dam declared an imminent hazard, forcing federal intervention. If they succeeded, I wouldn't just lose the dam, I'd lose everything. That night, I drove back to the farmhouse with a heaviness in my chest. I poured a glass of whiskey and sat staring at Pops's old photographs, him standing beside the dam in the 1950s, arms folded proudly across his chest. He had built it with sweat and vision, a legacy meant to last generations. Was I protecting that legacy or corrupting it by turning the dam into a weapon? The question gnawed at me until dawn broke over the valley. By morning, my resolve hardened. If Maggie wanted war, then war she would have. But mine wouldn't be fought in secret meetings or by shady lawsuits. Mine would be fought in daylight. With evidence, with truth, and, if pushed too far, with the undeniable force of the land itself. Because here's the thing Maggie had forgotten. Power doesn't come from titles, from bylaws, or from connections at City Hall. Real power comes from the ground beneath your feet and the water that runs through it. She had built her empire downstream, blind to the fact that one man held the floodgates. And whether I opened them or not, the storm she had summoned was already rolling in. The land remembers, and soon Willowbrook Estates would too. The winter storms rolled in like drums of war. Dark clouds gathered above the valley, thunder muttering across the hills, lightning casting jagged scars against the night sky. By January, the reservoir behind the dam was swollen beyond anything Pops had ever seen. Each downpour added weight, pressure, and inevitability. The water churned angrily against the spillway gates, a living force caged only by concrete and steel. Downstream, Willowbrook Estates sparkled with Christmas lights strung across rooftops that should never have been built. The irony wasn't lost on me. Those glowing ornaments were like warning beacons, shining bravely while the storm prepared to sweep them away. The HOA, desperate to regain control, doubled down. Lawsuits stacked up like cordwood, each one an attempt to label me as negligent, dangerous, unstable. Maggie leaned hard on her husband's city connections, pushing for an emergency declaration to dismantle the dam. But for every argument she made, I countered with evidence. Trail camera footage, federal inspection reports, water rights older than their entire development. The city couldn't act without federal approval, and the feds weren't buying Maggie's crocodile tears anymore. Her voice grew shriller, her smile thinner, but she still showed up on the evening news, claiming I was endangering families. Families who, I reminded the world, were living on stolen land. But storms don't wait for court hearings. On a Friday night in late January, the heaviest rain of the season arrived. Sheets of water hammered the hills, filling every gully and creek until the land itself seemed to groan under the weight. I drove out to the dam under a sky so dark it felt bottomless, my truck headlights slicing through the downpour. The roar of water was deafening. The spillway surged like a beast straining at its leash, foam spraying as waves slammed against the gates. My boots sank in the mud as I climbed to the control platform, the storm lashing me with icy needles of rain. I stood there, gripping the steel wheel, every muscle taut. 35 homes waited below, built on land my family had tended for generations. Families slept soundly inside, blissfully ignorant of the storm bearing down on them. I could turn the wheel, release the torrent, and let gravity wash away decades of greed, corruption, and arrogance in a single night. The dam was a weapon, and I was the man holding the trigger. But vengeance is easy, justice is harder. I thought of Pops. His calloused hands sketching dam plans on yellow paper, his voice steady as he told me, "We don't own the land, Jake. We borrow it from the future." That truth cut through the thunder in my ears. The floodgates weren't meant for destruction. They were meant for balance, for survival, for stewardship. Opening them in rage would make me no better than Maggie, who twisted laws and wielded power for her own ends. So I didn't open the gates. Not all the way. Instead, I adjusted the controls with precision, releasing just enough flow to relieve the pressure without unleashing catastrophe. The water roared into the spillway, a controlled torrent, flooding the low-lying golf course and soaking the manicured lawns, but sparing lives and homes. Nature got a taste of its rightful course, a warning shot carved in mud and debris. By morning, half of Willowbrook's pristine landscape was a swamp, tennis courts submerged, white BMWs stalled in knee-deep water. It wasn't destruction, it was revelation. The residents saw with their own eyes that their paradise was fragile. Built on arrogance, propped up by lies, the news crews swarmed in. Helicopters buzzed overhead, cameras zooming in on flooded driveways and stranded golf carts. Reporters interviewed residents standing ankle-deep in water, their voices shaky with anger and fear. And when Maggie appeared, blaming me yet again, the crowd turned on her. "You told us this was safe," one man shouted. "You said the dam was the problem." Another woman screamed. The tide of opinion had shifted. For the first time, Maggie was the one on the defensive, her empire collapsing under the weight of truth. Within weeks, the federal government issued its final ruling: Willowbrook Estates had violated environmental law, ignored watershed protections, and built illegally on land with federally protected water rights. Construction was halted permanently. Existing homes faced mandatory mitigation, and residents banded together, not to sue me, but to sue the HOA board that had deceived them. Maggie and Rick Thornwell found themselves at the center of multiple investigations: fraud, conflict of interest, even federal violations tied to the creek diversions. Their names, once whispered with fear and deference, now appeared in headlines alongside words like corruption and scandal. As for me, I kept the land, every acre of it. The court reaffirmed my ownership, backed by water rights no one could touch. Pops's dam stood firm, vindicated as both a piece of history and a cornerstone of the watershed. I invested in new monitoring equipment, reinforced the spillways, and partnered with local conservationists to ensure the land would never again be exploited by short-sighted profiteers. Willowbrook residents who wanted peace with the land found me willing to work with them, but the HOA itself was dissolved in disgrace. On the day the board officially disbanded, I walked out to the dam with a flask of whiskey. The reservoir glimmered. In the sunlight, calm and steady, its surface rippling gently in the breeze. I raised the flask in Pops's honor and let the warmth burn down my throat. Justice hadn't come with a flood, though the temptation had been real. Justice had come with patience, evidence, and the stubborn refusal to bow to bullies. The land remembers. It remembers every hand that tills it, every drop of water that feeds it, every betrayal and every act of stewardship. The HOA thought they could erase my family's history with paperwork and bulldozers. But in the end, the land itself took my side. The dam still stands, the water still flows, and the memory of 35 stolen homes briefly glowing with Christmas lights before sinking into mud will linger as a lesson for generations. This war was never really between me and Maggie. It was between arrogance and respect, greed and legacy. And when the floodgates opened, even just a little, the truth came rushing through. Maggie still strutted around like a monarch, parading her HOA board through ribbon cuttings and wine tastings, but beneath the polished veneer, fear had begun to creep in. She didn't know it yet, but her empire stood on quicksand, and every move she made only dragged her deeper. It started with whispers. A local journalist, Carla Mendez, had caught wind of my EPA complaints and reached out. She wasn't the kind of reporter who churned out puff pieces for ad revenue. Carla had a nose for corruption, and when she dug into something, she didn't stop until she hit bedrock. I invited her to the property one Saturday morning, and together we walked the perimeter of the dam. She listened as I laid out the history of Pop's work, the Army Corps of Engineers' involvement, and the federal water rights. She scribbled notes furiously as I handed her copies of my evidence: erosion photos, flow logs, and the 1923 water deed. By the time she left, I could see it in her eyes. This wasn't just a story, it was an exposé waiting to detonate. 2 weeks later, the headline hit the front page: HOA development under federal investigation for water violations. Maggie nearly choked on her Chardonnay when she saw it. Residents flooded her phone with panicked calls, demanding answers. Property values dipped overnight, and prospective buyers pulled out of contracts. For the first time since the project began, Willowbrook Estates looked vulnerable, and I had only just begun tightening the screws. Behind the scenes, federal inspectors arrived. Clipboard-toting men in hard hats prowled the creek beds, snapping photos and measuring diversions. They didn't announce themselves to Maggie, but she knew. The sight of white trucks with federal seals parked near her precious cul-de-sacs sent her HOA board into a frenzy. Emergency meetings were called, where they plotted strategies like generals preparing for siege. But the truth was, they weren't generals. They were amateurs, drunk on their own imagined power, and amateurs always make mistakes under pressure. The first mistake came in the form of intimidation. Maggie sent Rick, her bulldog, to pay me a visit. He showed up in a shiny black SUV, sunglasses on even though it was dusk, trying to project authority. He parked right at the edge of my gravel driveway, rolled down his window, and handed me a cease and desist letter typed on HOA letterhead. According to the paper, I was harassing residents, interfering with community harmony, and threatening legal action if I didn't withdraw my complaints. I didn't argue. I didn't even speak. I just smiled, pulled out my phone, and snapped a photo of Rick holding the letter. That single image, time-stamped and geotagged, became Exhibit A in my growing file of intimidation tactics. The second mistake was arrogance. The HOA board assumed their connections with local officials could shield them from consequences. They hosted a gala dinner, inviting council members, developers, and even the mayor to wine and dine in one of their model homes. What they didn't realize was that Carla had managed to sneak in as a guest, escorted by a sympathetic resident. Hidden in plain sight, she recorded every boast, every whispered deal, and every promise of campaign donations in exchange for leniency. When those tapes surfaced, it was a scandal bigger than anything Willowbrook Estates had ever imagined. But the third mistake, that was the one that truly sealed their fate. In their desperation, Maggie authorized the diversion of even more water, hoping to accelerate construction and finish the last row of homes before the investigation concluded. Crews worked around the clock, their machines roaring late into the night, churning mud and grinding rock. What Maggie didn't calculate was how fragile the diverted banks had become. Heavy rainfall in early October sent torrents through the weakened channels, flooding half-finished homes and washing out roads. New residents woke up to knee-deep water in their driveways, furious and frightened. Insurance companies balked at covering damages once they realized the flooding was tied to unpermitted work. Suddenly, Maggie wasn't just fighting me, she was fighting her own people. Through it all, I kept my cards close to my chest. To Maggie, it must have seemed like fate itself had turned against her. But I knew better. This wasn't fate. It was the slow, deliberate unraveling of an empire built on greed, each thread tugged by careful, patient hands. Pops used to tell me, the land remembers. Every misstep Maggie made, every drop of water she stole, every lie she told. It was all remembered, written into the soil and waiting to be revealed. And yet, even as the tide turned, I felt the weight of the next step pressing on me. The dam loomed at the edge of my property, its reservoir glistening under the autumn sun. 35 homes now sat downstream, monuments to arrogance perched on land that was never theirs. I had the power to end this entire ordeal with one simple act: open the gates and let the water flow. The thought haunted me. It was both terrifying and liberating. Terrifying because I knew the devastation it would cause. Liberating because it represented ultimate control, the kind Maggie had pretended to wield but never truly held. Each night, I walked the dam, running my fingers along the cool metal of the release valve. I thought of Pops, of his calloused hands. Building this structure with care and pride, would he have wanted me to use it as a weapon? Or would he have reminded me that water is life, not destruction? The questions gnawed at me, and I had no answers. All I knew was that the line was there, waiting, and Maggie was pushing me closer to it with every stunt she pulled. The breaking point came in late October. One of Maggie's board members, a wiry man named Glenn, filed a lawsuit claiming my dam was an unauthorized hazard. They argued it needed to be dismantled immediately for public safety. They didn't expect me to show up in court with my mountain of evidence: Pop's Army Corps of Engineers permits, the water rights deed, EPA complaints, and photographic proof of illegal diversions. The judge, a stern woman with no patience for theatrics, dismissed their case within minutes. She even scolded Glenn for wasting the court's time. Maggie's carefully curated image of control shattered in that courtroom, and the HOA board left red-faced, their confidence crumbling. But even then, Maggie didn't back down. She doubled down. The night after the hearing, I caught her crews sneaking back onto my property under cover of darkness, trying to reroute a section of creek. That was when I knew the war was reaching its final stage. Maggie was desperate, cornered, and unpredictable. And desperate enemies are the most dangerous of all. As I stood at the dam that night, listening to the faint trickle of water beneath the stars, I realized the battlefield had shifted. It wasn't just about paperwork anymore. It wasn't even about the land. It was about power. Who held it, who abused it, and who was willing to pay the price for it. Maggie thought she could take everything from me. But she hadn't accounted for one simple truth. The land wasn't hers to control. It was mine. And soon she would learn exactly what that meant.